All right. I actually want to just start this since, I feel like we've had multiple conversations with many of you on this issue. I wanted to start with more pointed questions. And if we have time at the end, we can do a summation. So the first question for the yes side is on equity. There's been lots of talk about this measure as focused on equity, and yet the largest project that cost the most money got the lowest rating from by Metro's own figures on equity. Something like 32% of the corridor I'm going to forget what the rating is. Hold on, let me read it to you. Percent of the corridor in equity focus area was the rating last fall, and that was 32%. All the other corridors had higher ratings, including the Sunrise Highway. Sunrise Corridor. Can you explain why, given everything that's happened since, including the pandemic, the light rail line would still be included in this project? Someone from the yes side, please.
This is Vivian Satterfield. I work for Verde, and I'm a part of the Let's Get Moving campaign. Rachel, thank you for starting the questions with an equity-based question, and also addressing the Southwest Corridor light rail. I have to say that a number of years ago, when I started looking at the plans for the projects that were eventually going to be included in this measure, I too was highly skeptical of the Southwest Corridor light rail. However, my perspective changed after I spent time on the ground, spending time in community, helping to facilitate some community meetings, and also meeting community leaders who emphasized how much the investment was going to help activate the anti-displacement plans that they very desperately wanted to have happen in their community to address affordable housing, to address ensuring that their businesses could stay, and that their community wasn't going to change as a result of this large investment. And so that turned me from someone who was highly skeptical, and I think that my criticisms around the Southwest Corridor have actually been well documented up until now, but looking at the totality of the packages and seeing how much of the investments still go into equity-based issues, such as complete sidewalks, such as lighting, such as the critical programs around anti-displacement, critical programs such as Youth Pass, a 20-year-long campaign spearheaded by Black and Brown young women for transit access for youth. To me, this actually does address equity in our communities, and that's why Verde is proud to support this.
All right. So I would, for the no campaign, I'd be interested to hear from Andrew or Sandy on this particularly, but anyone can take it. Is there something besides transportation that would be a better investment of public dollars for this time, particularly given that this measure will draw down a significant number, millions of dollars in federal funding? And is there a tax that you would support for that?
I'll lead us off on a tax of support, and then Sandy, maybe you want to follow up with the federal funding piece here. But we just supported a tax on profits with Metro. And in fact, we're standing side by side with the Metro Council to support investments in homeless services. It was a historic coalition of organizations that came together to pass what voters have uniformly said.
Let me clarify something just so we don't get off on a tangent, is that I think the idea behind this is that behind my question is the idea that the proponents of this measure have made a case for it in terms of jobs, in terms of, we could be doing economic development of some kind. Is there a different kind of investment that any level of government in Oregon, the city, the city, metro, state legislature should be making right now that would be better than transportation for bringing jobs and for spurring economic growth, given that we're in a recession?
Well,
Sure,
I think, Rachel, you know, what we said to Metro was not kill the whole thing. I mean, I've done what I do for a long time. I'm usually at the table raising money for transportation investments and working on the yes side. I've never been part of an opposition to a transportation plan before. And the equity investments, I mean, we supported when I had Andrew's job, we supported the Portland gas tax, which also were about safety and about addressing those issues, which are, you know, we agree to. So what we said to Metro is, let's take a pause. You've built a plan that's based on everything we knew in 2019 and 2018. The world changed in March of 2020. Let's take a pause. Let's look at what the right thing is going forward. And how do we do this in a right way? Are there things that we could be investing in? Frankly, I think we should be looking at how do we help employers stand people back up and get people back to work. But, you know, we like transportation planning. Let's just make sure this is the right thing for this new world that we're all in now.
So is the best thing that government could do for business right now no new taxes?
Well, you know what? We're going to be releasing soon a review of what's happened to business taxes in the last 2 years. It's been startling increase. What we need right now is we have a whole lot of businesses that have been devastated. They're not on their feet. What they need right now is help from government to bring back the jobs that were lost, stand back up, and operate you know, in a way they can be successful. We've never seen losses like we saw this year. They need help, not more burden.
So tax cuts, you're saying? Not
No
more
no,
tax
I haven't said tax cuts. I'm saying they need support from government. You know, we don't have any tax cuts on the table right now, but you know, what we need right now is to take a pause and look at it. And frankly, a tax on wages when you're trying to climb out of a recession is not the right way to go.
So should we be
Rachel, if I
leaving that federal dollars on the table? Is that not inviting our government to help us here locally?
Well, I've talked to TriMet, and I think I would suggest Willamette Week to call TriMet and ask them directly if they think they will permanently lose those dollars if they don't do this year. I don't think that's the case. I think the federal dollars will still be there.
Jake, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I mean, with all due respect to Sandy and Andrew, I just, you know, what's changed since March is that the bottom has fallen out for the lowest income workers in this economy. And when you look at the data that came out from the Office of Economic Analysis of the state or all this national data, you know, we are in this K-shaped recovery, as President Biden has said. And businesses are doing quite well. You know, I actually looked this morning, the 3 largest donators to this campaign, their stock is actually up compared to a year ago from where they are price point. And the massive amount of federal subsidies that went into recovery this spring and summer, we know was heavily tilted towards corporations. They are doing quite well. It is low and middle income workers that are really being hit hard. Particularly, we're in this temporary disruption from the layoffs that occurred in the immediate precipitating of the pandemic. But the long-term data is showing that it is those on the bottom of the economy that are really struggling. And so, you know, what we need to do is inject money into the economy right now. Everyone agrees transportation money is the best way to do that because it creates high wage jobs in the immediate term and strengthens your economy to make it more competitive for the long term and help build that recovery. And frankly, I think the business community has stood up and said, well, we want to shove more of the cost of this to workers. You know, we want to do a vehicle registration tax. Sandy brings up a gas tax. We know that is a regressive tax that is paid by consumers. Those are the people that can't afford it right now. And we need to make this investment, and the ones who are able to have the means to do it should do so.
I just think it's interesting. The idea that businesses are doing well now is quite surprising to all of us that serve businesses. I can uniformly say that is a false assertion. Last quarter was the worst performance in American U.S. history, economically speaking. Today's unemployment claims should be noticed. across the nation, far exceeding what they were expected to be. We are continuing to be in a downward economy. Most importantly, the jobs that were asserted that this newspaper covered that will be created are temporary construction jobs for an industry that was never closed down during COVID. And it's paid by organizations and businesses in sectors such as retail, hospitality, whose workers are the most impacted. So you make a great point, Jake. In fact, the businesses that are suffering the most will be paying this bill and will not benefit from it in the long term.
I mean, I can respond to that. We know that this creates high wage jobs in the construction industry, which is going to slow down from lack of private investment resources. You know, we pointed this out in our voter pamphlet statements, Daily Journal of Commerce, and saying that construction jobs are going to fall off a cliff here, and that it also builds the competitiveness of this region. You know, we know that transportation money goes to support a more strong economy. We are a trade-based economy, and it's also about being an attractive place to attract high-wage workers, which helps lift everyone up. And so I just think that, in terms of like the jobs that it's going to be hurting and the industry going to be hurting, I would really challenge the No campaign to provide any data. It's very telling to me the only analysis that is looked at this measure is on the yes side, about the jobs that are going to be created directly in construction, which are high wage, and then the money that infuses into consumers, which is going to extend to those lower income working professions as well. And we have this kind of neoclassical mumbo jumbo about how this is going to somehow suppress job creation, and there's no data. They've never done an analysis of the millions of dollars they're going to spend in this campaign. They haven't done a single economic analysis because they know that the marginal impact, like on a $50,000 year job of an additional $400 in cost, is not going to affect the employer. Employers are going to hire. I hire when I need capacity and I need workers to do the work. And so arguing this is somehow going to suppress job creation, I just don't see it. There's no data, there's no evidence to support it other than this kind of classical economic theory, which I don't think bears out.
Does someone on the no side want to respond to that? Do you have any kind of analysis of how many jobs will be lost as a result of the tax?
We are proud to support the tax on cigarettes that the state is proposing because we know that a tax on cigarettes, which makes them more expensive, suppresses smoking. We are in line with opposing a tax on jobs because it makes it more expensive and it suppresses jobs. And the ask about a basic analysis should be countered to Metro, which prepared an analysis, which is a 2-pager, which the firm that performed the analytics behind it, Echo Northwest, roundly said was an average job creation number, which did not exactly calculate the number of jobs that would be created, paid for by the industries that are most harmed right now. So I just don't think that there is a clear example that the yes side is providing of their proposed analytics on this side. We know a tax on jobs will hamper job creation and hiring of jobs, just like a tax on cigarettes will prevent smoking.
Yeah, and I did think that the Willamette Week did a nice job in its reporting in covering that the very analysts that did the work for Metro pointed out that, of course, there will be job loss associated with a tax on employee wages. Their own analysis shows that they just chose not to focus on that as they're trying to sell the short-term jobs that would be associated.
Rachel, this is Grace Krenick, and I'm the former Director of Transportation for Oregon a long time ago. But I was one of the feds that handed out the money, and I would like to challenge Sandy's assumption that the money will be around there again. I think the important thing about this measure is that in addition to the money it takes locally, it'll leverage in $2 billion of investment into the Portland area to help fund those jobs, and that's something that the other measures don't do. So there's an added effect of that money that is, I think, very important for people to know. And it's hard for Oregon to compete nationally in a lot of areas, and we compete quite well in the area of transit. So it's an additional add should be taken into account.
Yeah, and I can go on. Again, they didn't answer your question.
I think, yeah, they didn't give it. They did not provide a number, but they did, reference the analysis that certainly said there will be. I mean, that Eco Northwest did say they would expect job loss. Okay,
yeah,
but related to that, not net, but let's move on to a different topic. This one again. I want to start with the yes side on this. So is the best we can get politically as a region out of this amount of investment a fraction of a percent decline in greenhouse gas emissions. It seems like if that's what we're settling for, we might, in Portland of all places, the earth has no hope of of continuing to be a habitable place for human beings. Please convince me otherwise.
Thanks so much for asking a question related to climate and our current climate crisis, which has become, it's right at our front door. You know, I think that it's challenging to actually do the analysis, which gives you the GHG reduction. Part of that is because we don't know what the impacts will be from having a complete sidewalk network where people can actually have the choice to take a short walk as opposed to jumping in their car. We have a difficult way to project what the added benefit is going to be from a generation of young people utilizing youth pass and transit exclusively to get around to their jobs, recreational opportunities, and educational opportunities. I'm challenged with how to quantify that, especially for the future. But I know this is a first massive step, and the GHG reduction that we'll get by not passing this measure is going to be zero, if not continuing to decline. Additionally, I can't understate as much like how important it is for TriMet, the largest mass transit district in our entire state, to be electrifying their fleet in an accelerated manner. 40% of GHG emissions in our state come directly from the transportation sector. So to have TriMet electrifying their fleet rapidly as a result of this investment, I think is going to be a great change that we'll all see and will continue to track in the future.
And if I could, Rachel, hi, for the record, Juan Carlos Gonzalez on the Metro Council. Really great to have the opportunity to be with the folks of Willamette Week. You know, the climate crisis is something that I take very seriously and that I'm very passionate about. My generation is very passionate about addressing. And if anyone sells you a silver bullet to address the climate crisis, they're wrong. The climate crisis is a very complex situation that we're in, caused by decades of neglect to our environment and the systems that we have come to be used to in today's economy and society. But one thing that I can tell you about how this region tackles climate change, it's investments like this. And the truth is that our region can never address the climate crisis without these investments. And here's why. We are addressing decades of disinvestment and neglect at the state level to prioritize these corridors. And there's a lot of, on the no side, you know, there are a lot of people that will say, I have been a part of a lot of transportation conversations. I have brought a lot of people to the table. We have got so much stuff done, yet here we are. And yet we have these corridors, TV Highway, 82nd, McLaughlin, corridors that are so at a deficit that we have to spend this kind of money to get them up to par and build from it. Another thing that's really important to acknowledge, in addition to what Vivian mentioned, is that Metro is actively studying so many other tools that we can use to implement. What the No campaign is saying is that not only are they against this measure, but they're also embracing other voices across the region, criticizing us, saying that we're not using certain tools, but then also criticizing us for studying those tools and the impact that will have on the economy. The question on the table right now is about the status quo. The no side is about maintaining the status quo, about waiting, about delaying. People are tired of waiting. People are tired of waiting 30, 40 years for these improvements. And these improvements are about getting the regional system back to the 21st century and building on our climate response from here.
Rachel, may I ask the commissioner a question? If this makes so much sense, why did the Metro Council exempt public sector employers but left private sector and nonprofits, including small businesses, 50, 75 member businesses that are struggling to get back on their feet after being devastated in this economy? Why did you exempt public sector employers? I mean, they also are users of our transportation system.
Well, Sandra, thank you for the question. We haven't had the opportunity to interact in a public space, and I'm happy that we finally, yeah, nice to meet you. And I'm happy that we finally get the opportunity to. You know, I think as has been mentioned, you know, Metro modeled this mechanism after the TriMet payroll tax, and actually wants to drives me to want to clear up some of the biggest disinformation points that the No campaign is using by calling this a wage tax, which is false. TriMet actually had to seek legal authority from this legislature to have an employee-based payroll tax, and that's what you see on your payroll stuff. This measure, this tax is not going to be like that. This is an employer payroll tax, and that's a difference. This is a new mechanism for Metro, one that we haven't used. And in our process of doing that, we also discovered that we did not have the legislative authority to implement it at the scope that Metro did, at the scope that TriMet did. And so just like we do when we lean in with our conversations as we were negotiating with our partners, leaning in, always trying to find a solution, trying to find a path to yes, bringing people to the table, that commitment to public engagement. When we found that out, we had to make a swift decision to make that exemption. But what I can also tell you is that in this next legislative session, Metro is looking to clear up that legislative authority so that we do not have to create last minute exemptions like that and learn as we move forward.
I want to finish with the climate change discussion for a minute. Like, as far as I understand, TriMet has never conducted a full-scale study of its system of how to increase ridership. Maybe a bunch of the projects will obviously, except for Southwest Corridor, you know, a bunch of the projects to move buses faster through traffic will increase ridership. But I fail to understand why you all would go to the public to ask for this amount of money without analyzing what are the best projects to increase ridership, particularly in the context of working to reduce greenhouse gases. If public transit is the answer, why don't we know before we're asking voters for this kind of analysis? And I guess that's for Councilor Gonzalez, and I assume Vivian will want to weigh in on it as well, but please, anyone else?
Rachel, thank you. Well, as a community champion that has been working with TriMet for most of her career in the Portland metro area, I would actually love for Vivian to have the opportunity to take the first stab at this.
Yeah, thank you, Councilor Gonzalez. Rachel, we think we know what the solutions are. We don't actually really know. You know, again, it's based on an aggregate. We don't know what the impacts are going to be from having a complete sidewalk network, which then links up to a rapid bus network, which combined with, you know, smart signals, which give bus priority and jump lanes, what that's actually going to do to incentivize ridership. We think we know. We think we can aggregate all that together and have some sort of calculation for it. But human behavior is really, really hard to predict. And so, also with the diversity of transportation options that folks are given, you know, how are we going to quantify the amount of folks who are going to use active transportation linked with public transportation to complete their trips?
I know you're not like you. I would say you have clear eyes about TriMet, right? But why like advocate for moving forward with us without pushing TriMet to analyze where the bus line should go, where the bus stop should be, like where the actual investment needs to come, what they actually need to move the dial on public transit ridership?
I think we have a good structure, good bones to work with from TriMet, and you know, we're going to continue to have to work with their operations to, you know, enhance the bus lines that will see an increase in ridership. I know that actually we've got Keith here, who has a really close relationship with General Manager Doug Kelsey, who's articulated a really clear vision around his plans to grow ridership. I don't know, Keith, if you want to add in.
Hey, Rachel, good afternoon. I was on with Doug last Thursday, talking to him about this same question. So to answer specifically, is there a broad-based analysis of if we invest this much, do we get this return? And talking to Doug, and he says the underinvestment in our market is so great. There's such a crater. Our percentage of ridership at TriMet, this is pre-pandemic, is 4.1% and falling. And he says, Keith, look at Stockholm. Stockholm is a smaller regional MSA than we have, and they're at 40% in climbing. We're right about 2.4 million each. He says it's a matter of our mindset. but we have got to focus on putting the rapid back in rapid transit to move people out of the car. When you want to go from Portland to Beaverton and you can drive there in 30 and 35 minutes, or take transit and it's going to take 40 or 45 minutes, he said, you're not going to do it. Now, if we can get transit down, sped up, get it to 20 minutes, and you see the transit going by you while you're waiting in your car, he says, now we're going to have a quantum leap. We're going to have a complete shift in our overall infrastructure. And then he goes on to the Southwest Corridor and he says, without that part of the spine, without the spine added to our overall max network, without these 17 corridors of these grid lines being fed into, like Vivian said, exactly, if we don't feed into that spine, if we can't accelerate the network, we're not going to meet our climate mitigation goals. We're going to make sure people are in cars. And since 1993, we've had 252% increase in delay that I bet every one of us on this call, when we go to pick up our kid, go to the grocery store, when we leave the home, we're all going to get in our car. Andrew and I had the pleasure of living in New York. I never had a car, wouldn't have dreamt of having a car because it's inefficient. I would have spent all my time in the automobile and my cost would have been 10 times the cost it would be. And from an equity quality standpoint of life, without a robust infrastructure, transportation, spine, and grid, our economy can't move. And I can't get people to come to my work because I can only hire within a 3 or 4 mile radius of my office, instead of being able to hire somebody in downtown Portland or Beaverton to come to Clackamas and work.
It is embarrassing that we're even talking about climate with this measure. This is a joke. It is a
Kevin, it's a
0.05% reduction.
All right. So Kevin, I have a question for you as the, one of the state's preeminent political consultants. Hey,
Jake's on the call.
What?
Jake's on the call. Be nice.
I said one.
Okay.
I'm putting it on my website.
You have to stand up for him.
It's going to go to his head, Rachel. I don't know.
You think something can go to his head at this point? Anyway, can you answer my question? Is this the best measure that the region can hope for on climate?
This has nothing to do with climate. It is a 0.05% reduction in climate. If you wanted to make a 1% reduction in climate this rate, hey, I'm talking here, Rachel. If you wanted to make a 1% reduction in climate, you'd have to spend 140 billion at this rate. If you want to make it 10%, it'd be 1.4 trillion. This is about Metro wanting a permanent tax and wanting light rail, and they're trying to find any way to sell it.
Absolutely not. I know from firsthand experience, I was hit on Division when I was riding my bicycle at 35 miles an hour 8 years ago. It changed my life. That experience changed my life, right? And so when you think about how much the safety and the infrastructure needs, when they're adequate and when people can feel safe and taking alternative transportation, how that's quantifiable, I think that it's disingenuous to say this is just a cover for Metro your talking points just don't resonate with me at all. And there's a reason why a number of climate justice advocates, environmental justice advocates, such as myself and my colleagues, have continuously supported the crafting of this measure, not continuing to emphasize climate as well.
Okay, but I still didn't get an answer to my question.
No, it's of course not. This is not the best we can do.
Okay.
If this was about climate, this is not the way you'd spend $7 billion.
I have one more question for on this for Senator House. I thought you have the benefit or the opposite of me having gotten to watch the Oregonian editorial board's question answer before this, and I thought one of the strongest arguments for this measure is essentially that the state legislature left a mess for Portland to deal with and the Portland region. And I am wondering if you have any regrets about not including the Southwest Corridor line in the compromise transportation bill that was passed by the legislature.
Well, the 2017 transportation bill was $5 billion, and it took 2 years of work, and it was vetted. And was it enough? Can you do everything in every bill? No. Do we have enough money for education? No. Every level of education is underfunded. Healthcare, we don't have enough. So I think that was a pretty strong effort, and it got there because everybody was at the table, compromises were made. It was vetted by the Legislative Revenue Office, a team of economists that looked at things, and it was tricky. You can't use gas tax money for transit, for example, and there are all kinds of constitutional issues, and that was a lot of work. You're not going to solve all of the problems in one bill, but that was one bill. So my issue here is that's a great example of a place where the Legislative Revenue Office can help legislators vet these things through tax incidence modeling, and you talk about analytics, that's where it comes from. And what caught my eye in this measure, I've been a long-standing supporter of light rail and transportation, as I think most people at this in this meeting have been. But what caught my eye was most local governments, including Metro, don't have this technical capacity to look at these enormous taxes that have come up in the last few years, frankly, this one in particular, but these other tax measures have been as big as or bigger than what the Oregon State Legislature has proposed in the last few years. And you need that kind of technical scrutiny. And if you don't have it, mistakes show up. And I think we've seen a few of those already in this measure, the Moss-Adams warning to clients saying, oh, this is also going to apply to retirement and healthcare benefits. And I know Metro has said, oh no, we'll change that if it passes. We missed that one. And I don't think there's anything nefarious there, but I think that shows a mistake. And I think it shows a mistake that you don't have an ironclad system of the rates. It may be 0.75%, but now Metro's talking just before an election that, well, we might lower that. Maybe we'll phase it in. It's not ironclad, and that is just not sound public finance policy. And nobody would be able to get away with that at the Legislative Revenue Office. Legislators, I wouldn't be able to get away with that. And so that's what gave me pause on this. And you know, beyond that, a payroll tax 10 years ago when the legislature was trying to dig out of a recession and try to figure out how to get people back to work and plug budgets, the one tax that was taboo for Democrats and Republicans was a payroll tax because it was seen as such a disincentive for hiring. So
can I try my question on you, Senator Haas? What if you could, what would you like to see the state, the region, or the city pass in terms of economic development right now? Or would you advocate for walking away from passing new taxes right now?
Well, I think there's a way to do this, and I think Metro has a record of working with some of these groups and keeping people at the table and reaching consensus. And I think their record in the past has been admirable. So I think that's how public policy is made. And you don't do everything all at once.
Let the record show no one has wanted to answer this question directly. Nigel, do you want to take over questions for now?
Yeah, I just, for Councilor Gonzalez, I'm still a little bit puzzled by who's paying this tax and who's not paying this tax. So is Providence Health and Services paying this tax?
Providence Health and Services, yes, as a private employer.
Okay, so if you go to the Business Journal Book of Lists and you look at the largest private employers, or the largest employers in the region, right next to each other, Providence Health and Services, 18,000, OHSU, 17,500. OHSU gets almost nothing from the state, as Senator Haas will tell us. So why is Providence paying and OHSU isn't paying when OHSU pays the TriMet payroll tax?
Nigel, I think that's an excellent question and one that I'm sure that you researched very much before it got to me. As you know, OHSU is a quasi-public entity and one that falls in
quasi. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, it's a quasi-public entity, and well, the signals that we've sent to OHSU is a clear desire to figure that out once this measure passes.
Why would you put a measure of this magnitude on the ballot? You've told us that you've spent 2 years preparing for this, and yet here we are within a week of ballots dropping, and you still really don't know who's going to pay it. You've talked over and over and over about equity, and yet the payer model seems to be completely inequitable when you have two identical organizations from a size point of view and from a functional point of view, and one pays and one doesn't. It has the appearance that you as a council are playing favorites in order to get the support of public employee unions and other groups?
Well, Nigel, I really resent the insinuation that we're playing favorites because that's not the case. And what I would like to do in terms of, very profitable corporations paying their fair share and investing in their communities versus the legislative authority that we're granted and working within those boundaries, they don't always align. But, insinuating that we're playing favorites is not fair here.
Let me be clear. I'm not insinuating. I am accusing you of playing favorites explicitly because the rationale that you have put forward is just not credible. I mean, if you look at the TriMet tax, and we have the emails that show that you modeled this on the TriMet payroll tax, it shows that all those local governments that you have chosen to exempt pay the TriMet tax. So that the tax that you used as a model charges those entities. You've decided that you don't think you have the authority. You've had a couple of years to check with the legislature and see if you did have the authority. So what happened? Why didn't you do that?
The truth is we don't have the authority. The state legislature has constantly preempted local governments by in part for large business and business groups that don't want local governments to have the tools that they need to solve problems on the ground level. And we have to work within the parameters of what we have.
With all due respect, your CFO was in constant communication with TriMet. Emails show that he was in constant communication with TriMet saying, is PSU in? Is OHSU in? Who are you getting money from? So it's just not credible.
Juan Carlos, since it sounds like you're not going to agree with Nigel, can I at least ask, would you agree that it's unfair? You're arguing you don't have the authority. Is it in fact unfair to treat these two entities differently?
I definitely think that what we need to focus on is making sure that organizations are paying their fair share. I am one member of the council.
Just please answer the question. It's a yes or no question. Do you think it is unfair?
I absolutely think it's unfair. And I think organizations need to be paying their fair share. I felt like I expressed that when Nigel asked the question, but I am one member of the council, and the council has yet to make a full deliberation on that decision. And I'll speak for what I believe and what I want to see, and I know that community members believe that too.
We would ask for one thing that I think would be easy to resolve all of this, Councilor Gonzalez, and for Metro to provide a written statement and opinion of legal counsel that determined that you were required to exempt public sector employers, including yourself. If you provide that, I think we can all rest a little bit easier. And it would be a very simple thing to ask your council to do so. We did so 2 months ago. We have not yet received it, but we will give you the leeway to provide that council opinion.
And I think a reasonable request to make is for all those who are questioning the funding mechanism is to have a verbal commitment, not a written one at this time, to join us in an effort at the legislature to unlock all the restrictions that we currently have, such as the regressive highway trust fund restriction, and modernize our transportation funding system so that we actually do have all the tools and the resources that we need for local jurisdictions to make the determinations that they need around what safety looks like in their communities.
I don't think any of us would be opposed to that. In fact, again, I think the key thing for everyone to be aware of is we support transportation investments.
Well, I think that would have been.
So you'd be willing to go to the legislature and reform the highway trust fund?
I think that is a conversation that should have happened before you put a proposal of this magnitude on the ballot. I think we have to resolve this. We should have had a better conversation about this mechanism from day one, and now we're put in a position where we have to oppose a transportation measure, which in my memory has never happened before.
I'm hard pressed to think over 18 months of meetings, how many additional meetings we should have had in our process. Over the thousands of conversations had in every corner of the region, how much longer we should have had that process to result in the outcome that you're seeking.
Let's be clear. There were 2 years of meetings about where the money would go, 2 months about where it would come from, and 2 minutes to exempt yourself. So.
And the world changed in March. Let's just remember that. The world changed.
PBA was at the state legislature to make sure that the cap was not raised on on income tax. So like when you were supporting the homeless services measure, you were still lobbying against that. I was in the room for that testimony. Are you saying you're now willing to unlock that for PBA, or is PBA willing to unlock that for Metro? Did I misunderstand that?
I think we're talking about very different matters here. I think we're willing to engage in any conversation about transportation infrastructure and how you fund it. Those are worthwhile conversations. It's the reason we've been at the table for 2 years. What I think is just being lost on everybody that is advancing this measure is that after COVID struck, the world has been decimated economically. Nothing changed in this measure whatsoever.
Yes,
that's the difference here.
But the question was on what taxes would be available to Metro to levy in order to fund transportation, and your organization has specifically lobbied against giving Metro more leeway on a specific tax.
Metro.
So I didn't understand that point from you.
I want to be clear. Metro asked for their own cap to be lifted and then withdrew that request.
It was slightly more complicated than that, but okay. You have a point.
I'd like to just ask Councilor Gonzalez for another point of clarification. I promise it won't be about who's paying. It will be about what we're paying for. So a number of the projects, the 17 projects that are not the Southwest Corridor project, involve state highways. And Senator Hash just described the process that legislature went through to pass House Bill 2017. A lot of that money hasn't been spent yet, but there are a lot of local needs within the Tri-County area that are either county roads or city roads. Why is so much of this measure going to pay for projects on roads owned by ODOT, which has a massive budget and has its own funding mechanisms and controls those roads?
Nigel, I am so glad that you asked this question, and it's actually one of the more technical, wonky sides of what makes me really passionate about this measure. I think local governments have recognized that ODOT in general has struggled to maintain all of its assets across the state, and parallel to this funding measure and to releasing these dollars, as you know, through the technical documents, we've identified that Metro is a funder, and whether it's PBOT or Washington County, Clackamas County building the projects, we have a parallel process in place working with the state and with ODOT on jurisdictional transfer, which essentially helps us identify for this specific road that has been neglected for this long, who's the best owner, and what do we need to do to accomplish that ownership for local control. And that's just one piece that unfortunately that isn't elevated enough when it comes to obviously the political talking points, but I think is a huge game changer. It's a huge game changer that a lot of people have been fighting for in the state legislature when it comes to the Portland metro area, which is essentially to say, give local governments the ability to have self-determination over how our communities interact with these roads, these corridors, and how we make those improvements.
Thank you.
Hey, can I jump in, Rachel, on your tax issue? Metro has raised taxes $3.6 billion in the last 2 years. This would be on top of that. I don't think they have a problem figuring out how to raise taxes.
Fair enough. I had one more question for the yes side. Why not have this tax sunset at least, so there's some accountability after a period of time? I know that the business community asked for that on the homeless services measure, and while I don't think it would have convinced them to support this, I failed to see why you didn't at least have something like that in the measure.
Thanks for that question, Rachel. We, with this measure, are making massive investments. The dollar figure is large, and yet we are still playing catch up. This is simply backfilling the years and decades of underinvestment, and in some communities, largely where communities of color and low-income communities reside, it's active disinvestment. And so I too am surprised at how much asphalt costs. I am not in control, however, of how much it costs, and therefore I am grateful that this stream of investment will continue on into the future so that we can continue backfilling and then make additional improvements so that we can achieve the goals of this measure for the long term and the long haul with new technologies such as addressing climate change.
Wait, this thing doesn't sunset?
Nope.
Huh.
Hey, Grace, would you jump in there on that?
Her audio is not working.
Is there a project list for like after the projects that have been identified are finished, given that the money goes on forever?
Well, we have 20 years worth of projects that are within the current measure. And I would anticipate that a similar community-based process in which we had, for example, local investment teams taking tours of all the areas that were proposed into the what ultimately ended up into the project list, that we would undergo such a robust community process to identify those in the future.
Is there any plan to have local governments pay it at any point?
Appreciate the question. As I mentioned, we're looking to get some clarity on that legal authority, and after that, the conversations that we have with the state legislature, and if the state legislature grants us that, then we're going to have a conversation with our local governments about their ability and willingness to do that. So what I can commit to you is we are definitely going to address that head on in 2021.
But these are loose ends. The issue of OHSU and Providence, temporary or not, these are loose ends that should have been buttoned down. In the Student Success Act last year, we had a similar OHSU thing where it was a very thorny question. Do you put the corporate activity tax to apply to nonprofits? No, but what about nonprofit, those giant healthcare HMOs that compete with for-profit HMOs? And they were both paying the privilege tax, and it was a thorny mess, but we had to figure it out beforehand and figure out these loose ends and tie it together so that there was no question when it passed. We couldn't pass something and then when these questions come up say, well, we'll have to figure that out, and we'll try our best to do something that's fair. That just doesn't strike me as sound public finance tax policy.
I would suggest, though, it's not just a loose end, Mark. I think it's the whole point. Metro usually lives on bond proceeds and the gate from the zoo and from the convention center, which right now are, of course, hugely down. So having a permanent tax is, from Metro's perspective, a solution to many faceted problems, and a lack of accountability is the whole point.
Well, that's a lie, and I need to call that out. Kevin is lying, and what he's insinuating is a legal action on our part. And actually, I'm really glad that he brought up oversight and accountability. There are multiple layers of accountability in this measure across all the jurisdictions and the partners that are delivering this. A streamlined process, and obviously an independent oversight auditor that will have the ability, and has already in the past shown that they are willing to call us out and to hold us accountable for the commitments that we made to the voter. We're going to have an oversight committee, project steering committees for the projects, program funding allocation committees, regional equity coalition committees. I mean, if there's one thing that this measure has, and that I will not stand for, is calling us out on a lack of integrity and transparency in this process that we have led for nearly 2 years into building the accountability to the people that we built it for. That built it.
Just chime in here. I mean, I think a couple things. One is, yeah, there's no evidence that this is going to be reallocated towards other work at Metro, and the data shows pretty conclusively they had a cut list of projects, and this is certainly not everything that needs to get done in our infrastructure. It's just a start. And so this idea that we need to figure out what in 2040 we're going to use this money on at that point, to me seems like a little concern trolling. And I wanted to point out, although Senator Haas just left the screen, I will respond to what he said, which is, we've had a host of other local funding measures in recent years. There have been school bonds. There are a number of measures on the ballot right now. I haven't heard any of these concerns raised about any of these other tax measures that are present now or recently present. And this idea that you have to get it all buttoned up the first time. I mean, I know the legislature continues to work on technical fixes to the Student Success Act, because there are changes that need to happen in the tax code there to make sure that it has the intended impacts. This idea that you get one shot at this conversation, and then if it isn't 100% right, then you go back to the drawing board, to me just doesn't bear out to how the legislature approaches these conversations.
Well, I actually have a question for Councilor Gonzalez about that on the way the tax is written. TriMet has a payroll tax. We're very clear on how that payroll tax works. You guys could have lifted that language and used exactly TriMet's language, so it'd be much clearer on what the tax would apply to, but instead you've written very vague language, which we've now heard from Moss Adams, means this tax could be applied to benefits. It could be applied for all the employers who buy TriMet cards for their employees. That could get taxed. It could be applied to 401ks. Why didn't you be simple and clear and use language that already existed?
Sandra, I really want to point out a word that you used multiple times as you asked me that question, and it's could. You know, we could. And I know that the opposition is really running a campaign based on fear, trying to sow mistrust in Metro. I think that the last 3 measures that we've had on the ballot since 2018 show otherwise. So good luck and keep trying. But, you know, we've made it very clear in a public forum that that's not our purpose and that's not our intent. You're calling out our authority and what we can do, but we've made it clear that we're not going to do that. So I feel like I've answered that multiple times. And if you need more follow-up and clarity, I can follow up with you after this interview. But it's that cut and narrow for me.
I appreciate that. And I will just say, following up to Senator Haas.
We're asking the questions.
Sorry. I wanted to fit in one question on the Southwest Corridor line. Maybe this is for Keith, to follow up on what you said previously, but the ridership numbers for the Southwest Corridor lines seem fairly low for the amount of investment in a light rail line. I mean, it's what, a nearly $3 billion cost, and it's the last figures I had were just under 38,000 riders. Can you explain why it's so critical to have that line given those realities? I don't know if you're the right person to answer, but anyone on the yes side.
I can tackle a couple questions and then Vivian can be my closer. On today's numbers, you're right, but let's look at the economic development. So it's a $3 billion line. The government's going to pay, the federal governments are going to give $2 billion. So the cost to us is $1 billion. It's the best investment in the overall plan because it's being shouldered in large part, 2/3 by the government. So it's actually the best part of the recovery plan. Now, as far as the ridership goes, if we look at ridership today, you're right. But when we look at light rail, it's an investment for generations to come. We have 70,000 people in that region alone that's expected to come in very short order. And we have 300,000 in the next 10 years coming into our region as a whole. Again, it's that overall investment in the spine we have to put in now to get the rewards downstream. So that's a huge growing area for the Portland market.
Here's a question that's maybe dangerous because I don't know the answer to it, but I want to follow up because I'm curious. Is that a pattern that we actually see with light rail, that the ridership numbers increase a lot after the first 5 years, say?
So, and I'll speak to that. So when we invest in light rail, for every dollar we invest, we get a $4 return on other growth. It's a super catalyst for your transit-oriented design. The overall community moves to those lines. And we all see that in our infrastructure when we added the west side or the green line. You see this development that then starts to really aggregate towards those areas. And that's exactly what we want in speeding up our infrastructure.
Well, I know it's great for planning purposes and for urban development purposes. Right. I'm a huge fan in that sense. I'm wondering about the ridership numbers. My understanding is they go up fairly quickly on a new line, and then they plateau. We've seen ridership figures fairly flat for the red line, the blue line. The orange line numbers are really low, right?
And that's why all the other critical investments that are being proposed within this measure, such as a rapid bus network, such as lighting and sidewalks, can actually help grow ridership to that spine system on that light rail line. And so again, I take very much a holistic approach to this because I do not drive a car. I get around mostly by transit and on my bicycle. And so I think about the critical infrastructure needs, which make me feel safe enough to make that trip, and also based on distance to the places that I need to go. So I think that the one way to positively grow ridership not only is to generate the jobs and to have families who are proud to be working in constructing the light rail line, alongside having the safe infrastructure which feeds into it.
What I would say is that the planning and this talking about the infrastructure system, the transportation infrastructure system, is based on the old assumption that downtown is the center of all things and all transportation must go to and from the downtown core. Is that going to be, I mean, COVID has changed work, and we know that COVID has changed work forever. I don't know what it's going to look like in the future. I think we need to take a pause, and this is what we asked TriMet to do. Take a pause, not TriMet, excuse me, Metro. Rethink it. Let's make sure the assumptions that built this project continue to be true in the new world that we're now in.
Let's be clear, for a segment of the workers in our region, nothing has changed. They've been going to and from work every single day since the stay-at-home orders because they're essential workers. They don't have the luxury of working from home and calling into all their meetings like we're doing right now. And so although our transportation system, and even I have been very vocally criticized about how this is an old hub and spoke system, which isn't accounting for the tremendous growth and the transportation needs, especially of low-income communities and communities of color who are more likely to be transit riders. Looking at TriMet's own demographic around their ridership, the majority of riders are low-income people in communities of color, and they're the ones who need this rapid bus network to get them to the places that they need to go.
And they're the ones who built it. They're the ones who built this measure.
If you've heard the noise behind me, it is my son who is a janitor, an essential worker, who's exactly what you described there. So we understand that, and I would say for the record, they don't all work downtown.
Well, absolutely not, Sandy. And that's why this measure is so important, because it's finally prioritizing the regional arterials that are in East Portland, in Clackamas County, and in Washington County. I mean, the opposition, you want to make this all about how Southwest Corridor is a project that doesn't spark the room, that doesn't spark the flame, when we know that there's $2 billion on the table that we want to come here. We don't want those dollars going to LA or San Francisco or Seattle. We don't want to lose our competitive advantage. And we want to invest in these regional arterials. You know, our transportation modes shifting? Yes. Are we going to have to wait to see how those things continue to change? Yes. Are communities going to stop living alongside these deadly corridors? No. You know, those corridors are going to continue to be here. Our communities are going to continue to live on them. In saying that we need to wait, and saying that we don't know if they're not going to be safe anymore in 2 years, 1 year, 5 years, that, I mean, I don't even know what to respond to that, aside from just shock. And to me, feels like a loss of sense of what it's like to grow up in Hillsborough by TB Highway.
I am interested here that there seems to be a very serious philosophical response here to what government should be doing in an economic crisis. There are those of us who think that it should be bringing people together, prioritizing things, and being careful about the negative impacts of its actions, especially around taxes, given the economic impact. And then I hear very clearly the opportunistic idea of we should be going big, we'll figure out the details later. Don't worry about things like our principles around whether a tax is progressive or regressive. Just worry about what we can get and figure out what we'll do with it later. Two very, very different approaches to the world. But I would say this, for Oregon politically, this is a critical time. Every level of government is going to have a lot of problems figuring out service delivery. And I do believe Metro's ambition here steps on a lot of the politics that we're going to need to keep the state together and moving forward to recover from not just COVID, not just the economic crisis, but the fires and the crisis that are happening in a lot of homes across the state, or people just trying to hold on to their jobs and their family life and schools. This seems like an amazingly ambitious, amazingly arrogant way to try to move forward in a crisis.
Kevin, I would counter by saying, thank God we have Metro to move the area and region forward, because every dime that we pay in this tax is paid by us and is for us. With the federal government and the gas tax in 1993 being 18.3 cents, and it still is, it shows the abdication of responsibility from our federal. We can't rely on them. The old last century approach to the way we run our government has got to be more community-based, and that's why this is so valuable to us right now.
Kevin, I think what's arrogant is insinuating that somehow the families that are feeling our current economic anxiety are going to be the ones who will have to pay for this, because in reality, 91% of our region's businesses will not pay this payroll tax.
Oh, please. That is based.
All right. We know the arguments on this. Do you have any, Nigel, Mark? Do you have any other questions before we call this?
No, all done. Thank you.
All right. Well, we are past the hour, and I think we've gotten a good airing of the two sides' views on this, and I really appreciate you all coming in to chat with us. Our all our endorsements will be out on Wednesday of next week.
Thank you for the questions and participation all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Be
you.
safe.
Rachel.
Can I sit in? Talk about what we do now? Bye, guys.
Jake.